Story 1: The Farmhouse Tragedy. Laura had always loved thunderstorms. Growing up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, she found the rumbling of the sky and the flashing of lightning to be soothing, a reminder of nature's power and beauty. But one night, a thunderstorm would shatter her love for them forever. It was a humid summer evening, the kind where the air feels thick and oppressive. Laura was alone in the old farmhouse. Her parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving her to mind the animals. The storm rolled in faster than she expected, dark clouds swallowing the sky, and soon, the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time she had finished securing the barn, the sky was alive with streaks of lightning, and the deafening roar of thunder followed close behind. As Laura rushed back to the house, she noticed something strange, a light flickering in the attic window. She knew every inch of that house, and the attic had been sealed off for years, ever since her grandfather passed away. No one ever went up there. Her heart began to race as she considered the possibility that someone or something was up there. Drenched and trembling, she entered the house and locked the door behind her. She grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the beam cutting through the dim light of the storm. As she made her way to the attic stairs, the thunder grew louder, shaking the very foundations of the house. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, the door to the attic looming before her. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The air inside was stale and musty, the kind of smell that clings to old, forgotten places. But the light she had seen from outside was gone, replaced by deep shadows cast by the storm outside. Laura hesitated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and the remnants of her grandfather's life. She shone the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. She was about to turn and leave when the beam of light fell on something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest, was a figure, a man, hunched over, his back to her. His clothes were tattered and covered in dirt, and his breathing was ragged, almost like a growl. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she whispered, "Who are you?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly began to stand, his movements jerky and unnatural. Laura stepped back, her mind racing with fear. The man turned towards her, and as the light fell on his face, she realized with horror that it was her grandfather, or what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his skin decayed and stretched tight over his bones. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a low, guttural growl. Laura stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the room. The storm outside seemed to respond to her fear, the thunder roaring louder, the lightning flashing in rapid succession. She ran, not daring to look back, the growling growing louder behind her. She burst out of the attic and slammed the door shut, but the sound didn't stop. It followed her down the stairs through the house, as if the storm itself had come alive and was chasing her. Laura fled to the kitchen, grabbing the first weapon she could find, a butcher knife, and held it out in front of her. But as she backed into a corner, she realized the growling had stopped. The only sound was the pounding of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. She waited, every nerve on edge, but nothing happened. Slowly, she began to believe that it was over, that whatever she had seen was gone. But then, the kitchen door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his empty eyes locked on her. The storm outside seemed to explode at that moment, the windows rattling in their frames as a bolt of lightning struck the ground nearby. Laura screamed, raising the knife, but it was too late. The last thing she saw was her grandfather's twisted smile as he lunged at her. The next morning, her parents returned to find the house in ruins. The kitchen was destroyed, the windows shattered, and the roof had been struck by lightning, but Laura was nowhere to be found. All that remained was the knife, lying on the floor in a pool of rainwater, and the attic door, which had been torn from its hinges. Story 2: The Storm Chasers. Derek and his friends were storm chasers, thrill seekers who lived for the adrenaline rush of tracking and photographing the most dangerous storms. They had chased tornadoes, hurricanes, and blizzards, but nothing excited them more than a good, old-fashioned thunderstorm. So when they heard about a massive storm system brewing in the countryside, they packed their gear and headed out. The sky was already dark when they arrived at their chosen spot, a wide-open field that offered a perfect view of the approaching storm. They set up their cameras and waited, the tension building as the clouds grew thicker and the wind began to howl. As the first flashes of lightning lit up the sky, Derek noticed something strange on the horizon. A dark, swirling mass seemed to be moving with the storm, but it wasn't like any cloud formation he had ever seen. It was almost alive. He pointed it out to his friends, but they brushed it off, more focused on capturing the perfect shot. But Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm was moving in faster than expected, and the air was thick with electricity. His skin prickled, and his heart began to race. Then, out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning struck the ground just a few feet from where they stood, the deafening crack, followed by a blast of heat. The shockwave knocked them all to the ground, their equipment scattering across the field. Derek scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, but as he looked around, he realized that the others weren't getting up. They were lying still, their bodies twitching as if something invisible was pulling at them. Panicked, Derek rushed to his closest friend Tom, but stopped dead in his tracks when he saw his face. Tom's eyes were wide open, his mouth twisted in a silent scream, and his skin was covered in deep, jagged burns that seemed to pulse with energy. Derek wailed in horror, but before he could react, Tom's body was lifted off the ground by an unseen force and flung into the air. The others followed, their bodies twisting and contorting as they were lifted higher and higher, the storm swirling around them like a vortex. Derek could only watch in helpless terror as his friends were swallowed by the dark mass, their screams lost in the roar of the wind and thunder. Desperate to escape, Derek ran towards the car, but the ground beneath him began to crack and split, jagged bolts of lightning shooting up from the earth. The storm was no longer just a natural phenomenon, it was a living, malevolent force, and it was hunting him. He dove into the car, slamming the door shut, but the storm didn't stop. The windows shattered, and the roof buckled under the pressure as the car was lifted off the ground. Derek screamed, clutching the steering wheel as the car spun out of control, the storm tossing it like a toy. Just as he thought he would be torn apart, the car was slammed back to the ground with a violent crash. Dazed and bleeding, Derek crawled out of the wreckage, the storm still raging around him. But as he looked up, he saw the dark mass hovering above, its swirling tendrils reaching out for him. With a final burst of strength, Derek ran, not stopping until he was deep in the woods, far from the storm. He collapsed to the ground, his body shaking uncontrollably. The storm seemed to follow him, the sound of thunder echoing in his ears, but it never caught him. The next day, search teams found Derek wandering along a deserted road, half mad with fear and babbling about the storm that had killed his friends. But when they went to investigate, they found no evidence of a storm or the missing men. All that remained were the charred remains of their equipment and a single camera, its memory card corrupted beyond repair. Story 3: The Night Shift. Emily had just started her new job as a night security guard at a remote research facility. The place was located deep in the woods, far from any major roads, and was known for conducting top-secret experiments. Emily didn't know much about what went on inside the building, and she didn't care. She just needed the paycheck. The first few nights were uneventful, just long hours of walking the perimeter and checking the security cameras, but on the third night, a massive thunderstorm rolled in, the sky lighting up with flashes of lightning that made the dark woods seem even more foreboding. As the storm grew stronger, the facility's power flickered and the lights dimmed. Emily's radio crackled with static, and the security monitors began to glitch, the images distorting into strange, twisted shapes. She tried to call for backup, but the storm had knocked out the phone lines and her cell had no signal. Suddenly, one of the monitors went black, followed by another, and then another. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she frantically tried to restore the feed, but nothing worked. The only sound was the rumble of thunder and the howling wind outside. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, she heard a loud bang, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Emily froze, her blood running cold. She grabbed her flashlight and headed towards the source of the noise, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As she approached the lab where the noise had come from, she noticed that the door was slightly open, the light inside flickering. She pushed it open and stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of burning electronics. The lab was a mess, equipment was scattered everywhere, and the walls were covered in strange, blackened marks. In the center of the room was a large metal table, and on it was something covered with a white sheet. The sheet was stained with dark, wet patches, and it twitched slightly as if something underneath was moving. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the sheet, her mind racing with fear and curiosity. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but something compelled her to pull the sheet back. What she saw made her stomach turn. On the table was a grotesque, twisted creature, its body a mass of charred flesh and exposed bone. It was barely recognizable as human, its features distorted beyond recognition. But as she stared in horror, its eyes snapped open, locking onto hers with a burning intensity. Before she could react, the creature lunged at her, its charred hands wrapping around her throat. Emily struggled, the flashlight clattering to the floor as she fought to break free. But the creature's grip was like iron, its touch searing her skin. In a panic, Emily reached for her taser and jabbed it into the creature's side. The electric shock sent it reeling back, and it let out a horrifying scream, a sound that echoed through the building and seemed to shake the very walls. Emily didn't wait to see what would happen next. She ran, her lungs burning as she sprinted down the hallway, the sound of the creature's footsteps close behind. She burst through the emergency exit and into the storm, the rain pelting her as she raced towards the security gate. But the storm had taken on a life of its own. Lightning struck all around her, the thunder so loud it was almost deafening. The wind whipped through the trees, branches snapping and flying through the air like deadly projectiles. Just as she reached the gate, a bolt of lightning struck the ground in front of her, the blast sending her flying backward. She hit the ground hard, the world spinning as she struggled to stay conscious. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the creature standing over her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. When Emily woke up, she was in a hospital bed, her body covered in burns and bruises. The doctors told her that she had been found unconscious in the woods, miles away from the facility, with no memory of how she got there. The facility itself was gone, reduced to a smoldering ruin by the storm. No one could explain what had happened or what the creature was. All that remained was a deep sense of dread that haunted Emily every time a storm rolled in, a reminder that some things are better left undiscovered.